humidity, rain, etc., that can actually change DNA from one type to another?
No.
How do you know that?
Well, you know that at a very basic level because these things will not change the DNA sequence. Light, heat, all of these things will not result in changing the DNA sequence. If you think about the kinds of locations that we're testing lengths of DNA. Suppose you're doing an RFLP test and we're using my DNA and I have a DNA fragment that's 5,000 base pairs long. Degradation of DNA is a random process. There's no method or no enzyme that can go in from an environmental perspective and say, we're going to take that 5,000 base pair piece and it will then be converted to a 3,000 base pair piece. Just a nice clean thing, goes from 5,000 to 3,000. That isn't what happens. Degradation is random, so that 5,000 base pair piece, as it degrades, is going to be cut up in many different places. And so it just gradually gets smaller and in many different sizes. So there is no environmental force, there is no environmental effect that can work to simply change one type and make it become another. You may lose the type altogether. You may degrade the DNA so much that you can't type it, but you won't just change types from one to another. It doesn't happen.
Let's talk a little bit about storage. And you mentioned briefly about drying and, making a sample cold as being a means or a method to preserve DNA.
Yes.
Can you describe a little bit more about that? Why is that the case?
The problem with moisture, with high temperature and high humidity, is that enables bacterial growth, and bacterial growth will result in the DNA becoming degraded. That's generally the problem with high temperatures and humidity. Dry conditions and very cold conditions inhibit any kind of bacterial growth, and so they tend to be very good for storage. And keep in mind, unless your sample is sterile meaning the presence of no bacteria whatsoever, then any moisture and any heat will promote bacterial growth, and that bacterial growth will gradually degrade the sample.
What if you don't, for instance, refrigerate or freeze a particular sample of DNA? What happens?
Well, it sort of depends on what stage it's at. If you're just at the evidence stage where you have some stain on some piece of clothing or some other substrate, then you really will see different effects with moisture and heat. Once your DNA is extracted, and it's really very clean, you don't have bacteria in there anymore. They've been destroyed in the extraction process. You may have bacterial DNA, but you don't have living bacteria. They've been destroyed. And so once your sample of DNA is purified, it does store over time best if it's kept cold. It's usually stored at -70 or -20 degrees centigrade. But if you left it out on the benchtop at room temperature, you could really leave it out there for a very long time before it would be useless.
Your work in the laboratory includes the receipt of paternity samples for paternity tests, is that right?
Yes, the laboratory's work does.
How do you receive samples for paternity testing?
We receive samples for paternity testing usually by Federal Express, and they're usually drawn from the individuals that are going to be tested the day before. They're packed up in a styrofoam container so they can't break. They're shipped at ambient temperature, whatever temperature the air is, and received by us usually about 24 hours later.
And are these in the form of liquid blood in tubes?
Yes, they're usually liquid blood drawn into EDTA tubes.
Are these shipped? Now, you mentioned the term they're stored at ambient temperature, whatever temperature the outside is.
Well, that is, when they're given to Federal Express isn't putting them in a refrigerated vehicle. So they may be flown to us or come in a truck, but whatever temperatures happen to be in that truck or the plane or, all the various things it's going into before it gets delivered to us, that's what temperature they're at.
Does that create any problems in your ability to type these samples?
No, it doesn't.
What happens, for instance, with one of these liquid blood samples? Well, let me rephrase that. Do you, in the course of testing, even in your forensic casework, that is identification casework, other than paternity, do you receive samples in a liquid blood form?
Sometimes.
Are they maintained in any condition as far as refrigeration in terms of their shipment or what they're shipped in?
If we're receiving a liquid blood sample for a forensic case, it's usually shipped in the same manner. Occasionally it's hand-delivered. Mostly it's sent by some kind of carrier like Federal Express.
What can happen to these liquid blood samples? What do you see in your casework that can happen as far as the ability to type DNA?
Well, it makes a big difference. If we're talking about liquid blood samples drawn from a known living individual, they're usually drawn in the same way the paternity samples are, shipped to us, and they're just fine. There are other types of blood tubes that you can draw people's blood into that have other types of preservatives other than EDTA. Those other types of preservatives are not as good for maintaining the condition of DNA as EDTA is. That's absolutely that's the preferred way for us to have a blood sample.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, if the blood sample's from someone who's died, then you'd be more concerned to make sure that it had been stored properly and that it had been drawn in an EDTA tube.
Is that because blood taken from dead bodies is subject to this degradation process in a much faster fashion or faster fashion than blood from a living individual?
Yes.
If blood is degraded in a liquid form, whether it's from a sample from a coroner's office or a paternity sample or another sample that you receive in liquid condition, is there anything about that degradation process that can change the types of the sample involved?
No.
What happens when it degrades? Is it the same as happens to, for instance, a stain that you described maybe outdoors?
Yes, it's the same.
Now, as far as other things that exist out in the outside or in the environment, are there any in particular that can create a problem in your being able to type the DNA in that sample itself?
Any sample that is sufficiently degraded can be so degraded that you can't type it by any of the typing methods that are currently available. And there's an exception to that. It's typing of what's called mitochondrial DNA, which is DNA that is not in the nucleus, and that is the absolute last resort. That is, if a sample is in such bad condition you can't do anything else with it, you might be able to do mitochondrial DNA, and there are not very many places that will do that, that have that capability.
As far as what's out there, so to speak, in the outdoors, what about soil? Does it play any role in the ability to type DNA?
Samples that are retrieved from soil are very difficult to type. Frequently, you do not get any result.
Why is that?
Presumably, you have bacteria in the soil that are participating in degrading the DNA. However, I don't know of a definitive experiment that's shown specifically that it's bacteria. So I only can tell you because this is the common experience, it's in the literature, and many labs have had this experience, is if they are taking a blood or semen stain from soil, their success rate with those samples is very, very low.
What about leaves? Are leaves another item similar to soil?
Yeah, leaves aren't good either.
Would your answer as far as the reason why be the same as soil?
It would.
Is there anything about the presence of soil or leaves that could change the types that are found in a particular DNA sample so that they would be typed differently from what the contributor of that DNA actually is?
No.
As far as laboratory precautions that you take again, and let's focus if we can on PCR typing, the precautions that you described earlier. Is it a danger, for instance, if someone's coughing around a sample? And let's refer to an analyst.
Okay, so what you're asking me is if I have a piece of evidence and I'm going to do PCR analysis on it and somebody's coughing, could that present a problem?
Exactly.
It's possible. It's not, I don't think it's real likely, but I can't tell you that it's impossible.
What about sneezing?
Well, if you make it generic and say, if I, as the analyst, transfer any of my cells onto the sample, then I could create a problem with that sample. But you have to think how much material you're transferring to that sample relative to how much material is there in the sample already. So there's not a black and white answer to that question, and there may not be a simple answer to that question. There is an experiment in the literature where they actually tried to contaminate a sample by the way the sample was handled, and it didn't cause any problem. That doesn't mean that it would never cause a problem, so you do want to be concerned about it, but you shouldn't assume it will cause a problem absolutely every time something like that occurs.
In particular, are you referring to a publication in the scientific literature directly addressing the potential for problems as a result of some of these items we just discussed?
Yes, I am.
Who wrote that publication?
The authors on that publication are Kate Comey and Bruce Bedoli from the FBI.
Could you spell both those last names?
I think Comey is C-O-M-E-Y, and Bedoli is B-U-D-O-W-L-E.
And did that publication specifically deal with this question of whether or not these various influences could affect the ability to correctly type DNA samples?
Yes, it did.
What conclusions did they come to?
The conclusion that they came to was that careful, routine handling.
Sorry, I'll check what conclusion they came to.
Sustained hearsay.
As far as your reading of that publication, did that lead you to render any conclusions in your own mind about the appropriate way to deal with samples that are obtained, for instance, at crime scenes?
It contributed to my thinking about that, yes.
Did it corroborate what your opinion was before you'd even read the publication?
Well, at the time that I read the publication was during the time we were just starting PCR, so it added to my thinking, which was sort of still being formulated.
Incidentally, as far as a stain, let's say, at a crime scene, to your knowledge, is there any reliable method of determining how old that stain is?
Not to my knowledge.
As far as these environmental influence, actually, let me rephrase that if I may, Your Honor. As far as these items that we discussed, touching, well, sneezing, coughing, etc., do you have a personal opinion about their impact on your ability to properly type DNA samples that have been subjected to PCR amplification?
Yes, I have opinion.
What's that?
Sustained.
With regard to these various impacts, well, let me rephrase that if I can. As far as your own experience in the laboratory with testing samples, and I'm referring to evidence samples, has that included samples obtained from a variety or under a variety of different circumstances?
Of course.
How long have you been engaged in that? How long have you been in the laboratory gaining this type of experience?
Well, when you say you, really we're referring to my whole lab staff. Since before 1992, we did a lot of work. We did a lot of validation work before we actually began to use PCR on casework. So we have the experience from the validation work and from the casework.
As far as in the laboratory, and I'm going to direct your attention in particular to sample handling, for instance, extraction, amplification, and typing of DNA, have you examined the results from your casework since you've used PCR in your laboratory?
Yes.
Do those results include certain steps to determine if, in fact, the process of using PCR and then typing it is leading to or is actually including foreign DNA being typed in samples? Is that question clear?
I think so. There is a
Sorry, I'm still objection, both as to vagueness in the question, and secondly, again, foundation, since we don't know whether it's to samples that are coming in.
It is a speaking objection.
Sorry.
Overruled. Also a comment by counsel not handling the witness. Mr. Clarke.
Do you recall the question?
You want to start over?
Sure. As far as this actual PCR typing process that's gone on in your laboratory, do you take steps to detect whether or not there may be DNA present that you're able to determine types from that didn't come from a particular evidence sample?
Yes,
Does that involve the use of controls?
it does.
What is a control?
The control is some kind of sample that you use alongside your other samples or at some point in the process, again, to help you determine whether or not your process has worked correctly and whether or not you have a valid result.
All right. We'll return to the nature of the controls that you utilize in the laboratory a little bit later. But do those controls provide you with an opportunity to determine whether or not foreign DNA, that is DNA that's not part of a sample, is being injected into the process?
They help to answer that question, yes.
All right. And has that gone on since DNA, that is PCR type DNA testing, has gone on in your laboratory?
Yes.
With regard to these potential influences like coughing, sneezing, and touching, do you have an opinion about your ability to detect them as far as if they have any impact on your typing of evidence samples?
Yes.
What's that opinion?
With regard to handling the samples from the point of the extraction forward, the controls will allow you to determine whether anything that you're doing has had an impact on that sample. Obviously, we can't make any determination regarding what's occurred to the sample before it comes in our laboratory, because then the sample is as it is. We don't have any experience in our laboratory of picking up in a sample control the types of the analysts who have handled that sample.
So it's been your experience in your laboratory that these considerations, these things that can happen, simply don't happen in your laboratory?
It's been our experience that we are not detecting them happening in our laboratory. As far as we can tell, they are not impacting on the analysis from the point that we get the sample.
All right, Your Honor, I was going to shift gears again.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our recess for the morning. Please remember all of my admonitions to you. Please don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. And we'll stand in recess until 1 o'clock. All right, I'd like counsel here promptly at 1 o'clock.
Perhaps the best starting point is that in terms of the mixture results that we have obtained on numerous items in this case, we've never intimated that any of those items match anything. And I know that the court has been concerned with language from legal opinions talking about evidence of a match without a statistic is meaningless. These are not matches. These are results which are consistent with, or in another context, that sources have not been excluded by the testing that was done. One could imagine a scenario where you have two rapists and only one of them is identified, and a victim identifies that person, and both assailants have raped the victim and both have ejaculated, and DNA typing of either form is done, and it's clear that there's a mixture or a combination, more than one sperm donor, and we only have one defendant at the end of the table, and his type is consistent with the mixture that was obtained there. It's the people's position in this case, even though that's not directly on point, that that sort of evidence could be presented and explained to the jury what it means and what it doesn't mean without assigning any statistic to it. The court was interested in any legal precedent on the issue. I don't think there's any legal precedent that says that we have to do what the defense wants us to do in this case. And I think that's the appropriate question to ask. What is the legal precedent that forces us to do what they've sought or what they're seeking in this case? There is legal precedent in the conventional serology area that points out that we don't have to do what they've asked us to do. And not coincidentally, one of those cases is a capital case that I tried. I was the prosecutor in People versus Wash, 6 Cal 4th 215. I can speak from personal experience and also relate what's in the opinion, because this is what happened in every sexual assault case where conventional serology was done. Where conventional serology was performed, and we haven't heard much about an aspect of DNA typing that dramatically changed forensic analysis, and that is in DNA typing, it is possible to separate the male DNA from the female DNA in sexual assault cases. And that's why in sexual assault cases, DNA typing of any form is a very powerful tool. Before DNA typing came along, it was impossible to separate out the male biological material from the female biological material. And each and every sexual assault case, the evidence was presented as a failure to exclude. And People versus Wash stands for that proposition. What People versus Wash does not stand for is a proposition that the defense is arguing in this case that has never been applied in conventional serology, that in those sexual assault cases, in order to present any of our results of a failure to exclude, we would have to sum up all of the possible combinations of the biological markers of both the male and the female. And so I point that out because there's a total absence of any legal issue on that point. We were never compelled to do that. We didn't do it in Wash. It was not done in another California Supreme Court case dealing with sexual assault evidence, People versus Ashmus. It is impossible to separate out biological markers.
How do you spell that?
ASHMUS. The site is 54 Cal 3rd 932. So I just point that out because they don't say we don't have to do that, but they do stand for the proposition that the same arguments could have been applied and were not applied in that situation. I think it's important to look at where this issue first came or became injected into this case. I'm not sure who wrote this brief, but it's replete with references to Professor Thompson, where he writes his own brief and then cites things that he's published on this article, or in the article. If you recall, and this began on page 21 and it spanned several pages, if you recall, the argument was first broached in an admissibility context. The evidence would not be admissible unless. And if you recall, the initial argument was that we should not be allowed to report if we had a mixture that clearly came from more than one person, that we should not be allowed to say, aha, we see one of these people in there and the frequency for that one person is 10%. And that was never our intention. Our board does not have frequencies. That's simple. And so the argument
Frequencies as to mixtures.
as to mixtures,
All right.
as to mixtures.
So
Then
you're only seeking to report that as a failure to exclude.
We're seeking to report the data, and I'll get to that in a minute, why that's important. And if there are innocent explanations for this, we'd love to hear what they are. But I'll discuss the data in just a second. Professor Thompson's brief then goes on to claim that there's nothing about the forensic context, there's nothing about the observations in these tests that can allow a scientist to assign relative proportions or to sort out what's clearly a mixture. And that's all well and good. That's what Professor Thompson says, but he's not a professor in forensic science. The defense's own primary PCR consultant, the fellow whose name I keep mentioning, Dr. Blake, has published extensively on interpreting mixtures by relative intensities. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. I doubt we'll be seeing him in this case, so this is the most that we can hear from him. But an article, I think it's the casework article in the Journal of Forensic Sciences by Edward Blake, Jennifer Mihalovich, M-I-H-A-L-O-V-I-H, Russ Higuchi, Sean Walsh, and Henry Ehrlich at page 706. Dr. Blake and his colleagues say, the detection of mixtures depends in part on the fact that any one individual can have at most 2 alleles of a given gene. The presence of more than 2 alleles in a sample indicates a mixture. Even if only 2 alleles are present, a mixture can still be detected if the 2 samples are mixed in different proportions. In this case, a mixture is suspected if the relative dot intensities corresponding to the 2 alleles are very different. And then he goes on to describe other things that appear in sexual assault cases. Later on at page 722, in the same article, Dr. Blake again discusses mixed genotypes. Another issue that has arisen in some cases is the ability to analyze mixed genotypes in biological evidence. And then the passage discusses how you can do that. Probably the most instructive article by Dr. Blake, it's a chapter in a book Chapter 17. Unfortunately, I don't have the title of this book. It's called Applications of PCR to the Analysis of Biological Evidence. It's by Cecilia von Beroldingen, that's 2 words, B-E-R-O-L-D-I-N-G-E-N, Edward Blake, Russ Higuchi, George Sensabaugh, and Henry Ehrlich. And in that chapter, Dr. Blake has a very interesting casework example. And I'll just paraphrase it. It's a sexual assault case where the victim had had consensual sex with her husband, I think 9 hours prior. And when the evidence was analyzed, a sample, you always try to obtain a sample from the last consensual sex partner in a sexual assault case, just to make sure that what you're getting is what you think you're getting. And in this case, Dr. Blake not only sorted out by relative intensities and found a much bolder pattern for the person who was accused of the crime, but he said, oh, there's a fainter pattern there, and that's consistent with the husband. And then Dr. Blake, in this mixture, did something that we don't seek to do in this case. He calculated the frequency for the bolder pattern, because that was the assailant in the case. Why sum up when you know where the other stuff came from, the DNA pattern from the victim's husband? So while it's easy for whoever wrote that brief to say you can't do that, there's neither the law on their side to say that we can't do. All we're doing is we say, here's a mixture, here are the alleles that we saw, here's the data that we saw with no frequencies. Now, it is, for example, there are 2 series, I think, and specifically with respect to the Department of Justice results. There are 3 stains on the center console of the Bronco. They show a clear mixture. There's more than 2 alleles. And what's clear is that the mixture could not be from Mr. Simpson alone because there's more than one person clearly there. What is also clear is the mixture just happens to contain alleles from the 2 victims in this case. We turn the table a little bit when it comes to the glove. The glove, and this, I'm just talking about the PCR context of this glove. On the glove, by both RFLP and PCR, there are discrete stains that type very powerfully to Mr. Goldman and nobody else. Very powerfully. The frequencies or the estimates in that are in the millions. There are others which are combinations of both Nicole and Ronald, and those were typed by both PCR and RFLP. And there are relative intensity differences in both the RFLP and PCR results in those cases. And that is all part of the forensic picture on this case. So when it comes to several stains that are right around the notch area where we see these consistencies, we see something that is inconsistent with the 2 victims in this case that we've proven very powerfully are there. And among the 3 people that were involved in this case, it is only consistent with Mr. Simpson. And that is all the jury that we want to tell the jury. To preclude us or to try to present some sort of estimate about that calculates a meaningless expression, there is simply no legal basis for it and is totally contrary to the defense's leading expert on this area, whom we will probably never see in this courtroom, Dr. Blake. I think finally, we've gotten the cart before the horse in this case. We have boards. They have launched an objection. I think they're the moving party in that instance, Your Honor, and all they have said is, you have to do something. I have demonstrated, and I'll be glad to provide copies of those articles, that there is a scientific basis for us to do what we want to do. They have not demonstrated that there is no scientific basis. I think it would be appropriate at this point. They have never suggested what those frequencies should be in this. And I can tell you, having dealt with statisticians, that you can define a different question that will change the number. I would suggest that, and all we're asking to do is, we want to present our results to people who are anxious to hear the results of this typing. The defense does, and there are no statistics on those boards. It has always been our intention with mixtures not to present statistics, but to explain the results fairly, equivocally, and unambiguously, and let the jury decide what they mean. The defense, on the other hand, wants to force us. This is the narrow legal issue that has allowed me to speak for 15 minutes. The defense wants to force us to put a meaningless number up there that they can either elicit on cross-examination. We know they can't call Dr. Blake on this point, but call somebody else to do that. And I think it's time to move on with the trial and deny their objection to this, or the alternative is to force them to sustain their burden of proof that there's both a legal and a technical objection to it. And at that point, we will be happy to explain in or out of the presence to the jury why we should be entitled to present the results in the form that we would like to present them.
Mr. Harmon, when do the people anticipate getting to actually presenting these results?
Could Mr. Clarke address that, because he's up now?
As far as the results boards themselves,
And specifically the mixtures.
I anticipate that we will start the viewing of autoradiographs, but not get as far as the results that are at issue, the mixtures.
This afternoon.
Correct.
All right. Mr. Neufeld.
Well, I think what you do have here, Your Honor, is an attempt, at least by Mr. Harmon, to selectively present statistics to this jury. And frankly, in the words of Marcia Clarke, what's really going on here, I think, is an effort on their part to mislead, distort, and confuse the jury by doing so. And in response to Mr. Harmon's suggestion that there's no legal authority to the contrary, there is. In People versus Barney in the First Department, they said explicitly that if you want to present DNA evidence, you do so with statistics, otherwise it has no evidentiary value. And Your Honor adopted that same ruling in the court's opinion on the DNA objections on April 7th of 1995. Dr. Blake, by the way, who Mr. Harmon refers to, routinely, in trial case after trial case, aggregates in mixtures the various genotypes and always gives a sum. That's been his standard practice. We've seen him do it in more than a dozen cases. And that's the procedure, in fact, used by serologists and geneticists all over the country, as far as we know. It's also the policy and practice adopted unequivocally in the National Academy of Science inquiry into the proper usage of DNA testing, where
You want to
it's...
cite me to the page
Yeah, I'm
in
gonna give you the
NRC
page, Your
report, please?
One second. On page 59, it says, and I quote, "If a suspect's pattern is found within the mixed pattern, the appropriate frequency to assign such a, quote, match, unquote, is the sum of the frequencies of all genotypes that are contained within that mixed pattern." Okay? So that's what they're saying. I've never seen any scientific authority any place to the contrary. It is the standard practice used by professional serologists and geneticists when testifying to the results of a mixed stain that I'm aware of. I'd also point out, Your Honor, and I don't want to spend much time on it, but you may recall when we brought up this issue last week with you, you said if they had any legal authority to the contrary, that it should be given to the court last Friday and to given to counsel last Friday. I asked again whether there was any authority yesterday, and I was told there was none. And all of a sudden, Mr. Harmon comes in here to present his argument, and for the first time we're hearing references to legal authority. And I don't believe that that's consistent with the instructions that you've given in not only in this particular issue, but all issues that have come before Your Honor during the pendency of this case. I don't even know, because I haven't seen those cases yet, whether or not this specific objection was even raised. Did the trial lawyer say that it was error to admit the evidence in the absence of statistics? And was that issue precisely addressed on appeal and resolved by the appellate court? So I don't even know if the cases even stand for the proposition that Mr. Harmon is suggesting. But you do have legal authority here, and the legal authority is Barney. And the conventional serology cases, Your Honor, are not terribly useful in this point because Barney was decided in the context of the power of DNA evidence, the certain cachet that comes with saying you have a DNA match. And we all know that outside this courtroom, that we're talking about things like uniqueness or an extremely rare possibility. We're not talking about items such as 1 in 20 or frequencies of 1 in 40 from conventional serology. We're talking about much, much rarer instances here. And it was because of that that the court in Barney decided that unless you say what that match is or what that inclusion is, and by the way, whether you call it a match or in a mixed stain context and inclusion, you're basically saying the same thing. In fact, Robin Cotton earlier today was asked to address exclusions and inclusions and was very clear from what she said that when you're talking about inclusions, you're talking about that so-called match. And I think you even ruled in the past that they're free to use those words interchangeably when describing the concurrence of data in a particular DNA profile. And so what we're saying is, and what the court basically ruled in Barney, is it's a foundation issue. It's a foundation issue. You cannot present evidence of an inclusion or a match, whether it's in a mixed stain or any other type of stain, unless, along with it, you give the jury some generally accepted view of the statistics of that. Now, you've already ruled that they're allowed to give estimates based on the product rule, and they're not required to use some other approach. But at least they should be required to use that same product rule that they use for giving frequencies on the single source stains to the mixed stains. And there's a very straightforward way to do that. It's the way that's described in the NRC report. It's the way that any experienced scientist would do it. You simply look at the different frequencies. They could be the frequencies that Cellmark already has for those different genotypes, and you aggregate them. It's as simple as that. Otherwise, you really do mislead the jury. I gave you an example the other day of one mixture that they would present through cell mark diagnostics, and that's a mixture on the steering wheel in the Bronco. If you have these other types of evidence where you're saying there's an inclusion and it includes Mr. Simpson or it includes someone else, and you then have a number for that match, and you give it a number of 1 in a million or 1 in a billion or whatever, and then in the very next item you say we have this mixed stain and it also includes Mr. Simpson, but we don't give a frequency for that. Then under 352, the likelihood of confusing the jury and leading them to infer that that match has the same power as the match just above it is extraordinary. And in the example I gave, Your Honor, the percentage of the population which would not be excluded by that mixed stain profile on the steering wheel is about 38% of the population. Now that's a far cry just on a gut level from the kind of power that we ordinarily attribute to DNA testing. And that's why Barney says you have to give a statistic, that's why the NRC says you have to give a statistic, and frankly I believe that's why you said it in your decision last month. And I'm simply asking that the same thing be accorded to the people at this time.
All right. Thank you, counsel. All right, Mr. Harmon, I haven't had the opportunity to read the case law that you've cited to the court. I will read that, and since we're not going to get to those results this afternoon, I'll have the evening to think about it. All right, let's proceed with the jury. Going direct examination by Mr. Clarke. Good afternoon, Dr. Cotton.
Good afternoon.
Doctor, you're reminded you were still under oath, and Mr. Clarke, you may continue with your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Cotton, you spoke just before the lunch break about the use of controls, and I believe you briefly described what their purpose is. Could you state again why controls are used in testing?
In general, you're using controls to help ensure at the end of the analysis that the steps worked as they should. That is, an example of that would be you have a type for a PCR analysis and you've typed that sample many times, and so you type that sample along with your evidence samples and you make sure that the type that's expected from this one sample you've typed many times comes out as it should. If it doesn't, it tells you that something could have gone wrong during the analysis procedure.
As far as RFLP testing and the use of controls, if I ask you later to examine and describe an autorad or a series of autorads, will you be able to point out the controls on that autorad?
Yes.
Then let's turn to PCR typing and the use of controls. Do they play the same or in any manner a different role in PCR typing than they do in RFLP typing?
There is one of the controls that's used in PCR that basically plays the same role as the controls in RFLP. And there are two additional controls that are done that sort of play slightly different roles in the PCR procedure.
What role does the use of controls have in this PCR typing process? Why do you use them?
You use one known sample to ensure that the procedure worked as it should. And you use two different negative controls, that is, controls that do not have any DNA in them. And one of them starts at the very beginning of the procedure, and then one of them starts at the point that you set up the amplification. And they are in there to control that in your handling of the evidence and known samples that you didn't add any DNA inadvertently in the processing for the PCR. And there is actually one other type of control that is done with PCR but may not be done in every instance, and that is if you have say a stain on a garment, you might take an unstained portion of that garment and have that go through the process also. The interpretation of that control, should you get something, may be somewhat difficult. And if you don't get anything, then it just says you didn't have anything in this one area that you tested.
All right. The first type of control that you described was a control with a known type of DNA in it for PCR typing?
That's right.
And then you also described, and you used the term negative controls. Does the negative control name come from the fact that there's no DNA in them?
That's right. The known sample that you're typing is called a positive control. That is, you're putting DNA in there and you know what that result should be. The negative control, you are purposefully starting with a blank tube, adding your PCR reagents, but no DNA, and therefore, since you're not adding any DNA, you shouldn't get any result.
And then you also said that there was a fourth type of control?
Well, there's a third type that in our lab is called a reagent blank control. That control is started at the time you're putting your evidence into the tube. You're carrying alongside of that a blank tube. So let's say we have tube 1 and tube number 2, and 1 you're putting your evidence in. In tube number 2, you're not putting anything in there. But then in the process, for example, of doing the DNA extraction, you're adding some things to your evidence. So you are also adding them into the empty tube. So it's a way to make sure that everything that you added to your sample did not have any additional DNA in it.
All right, Dr. Cotton, what I'm going to ask you to do, with the court's permission, is to, on a single piece of drawing paper, is to describe or list these controls used in PCR typing.
Okay?
Would you be able to do that?
Sure.
All right. Your Honor, may that then be marked as, I believe, 254?
254. We'll entitle this controls.
PCR controls, if that would be
All right.
appropriate.
All right, Dr. Cotton, if you'd oblige us again. Mr. Clarke.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Cotton, if you would, could you label this particular piece of paper PCR controls? And I believe you had described that the first control was a control with a known type of DNA in it,
That's the first one that I mentioned.
and I think you used the term positive control?
Yes.
All right, could you write positive control? And if you would, describe again what its role is in this typing process.
Positive control contains a known DNA sample that has been typed many times, so the type for this known sample is known. So you have a known DNA sample. You carry that's set up at the point the amplification is set up, and it's carried through the rest of the typing procedure. If the types in that known sample do not come out as they should, it would be an indication that something had gone wrong in that analysis step, in the series of steps that you've used.
In other words, you know what the type of that positive control is, and if you don't detect that type at the actual portion of the test where you determine types, then you know something has gone wrong.
That's right.
All right, what was the second type of control that you described?
The second type I described was a negative control.
And is there one or more than one negative control used in each test?
There is really at least two and possibly a third type, all of which could be considered to be a negative control. But we did give them different names so that you don't get confused.
Okay, then if you've listed under negative control, is there then two versions of a negative control?
Well, it depends if you want to call the substrate control, that's a version of a negative control
Okay,
also.
if we could, we'll talk about substrate control separately. So
Okay.
ignoring that for the moment, could you describe the other two types of negative controls used in the test?
Okay, one of them we're just going to call the negative control. And that's set up when the amplification is set up. And the same is true of the positive control. It's set up at the time the amplification is set up. And what I mean by that is that you've extracted your DNA and now you're carrying it into a separate area and you're putting it in a tube and the PCR mix, the polymerase and the primers and so forth. This negative control is set up at that time, and this positive control is set up at that time. And this negative control has everything added to it that all the other samples do, except there's no DNA in there at all.
What do you mean when you say it's set up at the same time? What's that term mean?
Simply that you're putting the things you need out on the bench so you can work with them, and you're physically going through the process of taking your tube for sample number 1, putting in the PCR mix, putting in the DNA. You actually put some oil in these samples also, and then setting that tube aside and going on to the next one.
Why do you use this negative control? What's its purpose?
The PCR components themselves, the mix that has in it the primers and the enzyme and the A's, T's, G's, and C's, that could possibly be contaminated with DNA if it were not handled properly. So all of these negative controls are a way to make sure that everything you're adding to the sample is free of any extraneous DNA.
What happens in the typing process if you determine that in your negative control, for instance, are types that shouldn't be there?
Generally, and I'm saying generally because there may be an occasional exception in a laboratory to this, but generally if your negative control comes out with a type, you would disregard all the results for that test and go back and repeat the test.
Okay, is there then a second, as you described, type of negative control?
Yes, and in our lab, that's referred to as a reagent blank control.
What does that control consist of?
It consists of everything that was added to the evidence from the beginning of the analysis. If you break the analysis down into DNA extraction and then setting up the amplification, in both those procedures you're adding things to your evidence samples or to your known samples. So this control makes sure that when you add things to the PCR setup, those components don't have DNA. And the reagent blank control does the same thing, but goes back as far as the DNA extraction and lets you assess whether or not in adding things to the evidence to perform the DNA extraction that you were not inadvertently adding some DNA in there.
As far as inadvertently adding DNA, how does this control perform that process? Actually perform that role?
Let's say you have a tube in front of you and you're beginning to do your DNA extraction and you're adding some solution that is a chemical solution. It might have salt. It depends on how you're going to do your DNA extraction. You want to make sure that that solution that you're adding hasn't any DNA in it. So everything that you add to I don't know how else to say it, everything that you add to the evidence gets added to this blank tube. So at the end, if you have DNA in this blank tube, that tells you that you would have been, the same things that got added to that blank tube also got added to the evidence. It tells you you might have inadvertently added some DNA-containing cells to the evidence.
And if you see results in this negative control where you actually see types, what does that tell you?
If you saw a full-blown type, you would certainly declare the results of your analysis inconclusive. There For most instances, if you saw something in the reagent blank, you would declare your results inconclusive. I can think of a few examples of when you wouldn't do that, or you might consider not doing that, but in general, that would be what you would do.
So is this then a third alert to you of potential problems?
Yes, that each one of these controls is an alert to you of a problem that could have occurred, and it helps you sort out where that problem could have occurred.
And then again, I believe you said there was a fourth control as well, or actually a third type of control, but a fourth control.
If you do a substrate control, that's another type of control.
On these typing strips themselves, is there an additional control?
On the typing strips themselves, there is a dot which needs to appear in order to assure you that you had enough amplified DNA to get a reliable result.
As far as these dots, do they alert you to the potential of problems in this typing process? And I'm referring to the dots that you just described, that have DNA in them.
The control dots,
Control dots, yes.
they don't alert you to a problem, they alert you to the fact that they say you had enough DNA in your sample, that is, you had enough amplified DNA in your sample, and the results on this strip are reliable because you can see this control dot. If you don't see the control dot, it may mean that you're missing some types. You may see some types, but you can't be assured that you're seeing every type that could be there.
As far as these that control dot, was that in fact present on the typing strips that were passed around to the jury earlier, although bearing in mind that those strips had not been developed?
Yes, the control dot on the strips that were typed around is designated with an S. And you wouldn't have seen it because they haven't been developed, but where there was a designation for an S, that's where the control dot would be.
Your Honor, if we may, I would like to ask the witness in this subject area some brief questions, and the exhibit is equals 252 in one of the large charts.
All right, would you like Dr. Cotton to remain there?
No, actually, I think, Dr. Cotton, if you could just stand by and not get hit by the chart. Mr. Fairlaw.
Mr. Clarke.
Thank you. With regard to this chart, Dr. Cotton, People's Exhibit 252, the strips that we see on the left-hand side of this diagram, those are strips that are used to type what genetic marker?
The strips that are depicted here are for typing the DQ alpha marker.
And on those strips, is there a specific location where the control dot is that you just described?
Yes.
Could you point that out, please?
It's just to the my right of the C here. So this dot that is between the C and the number 1.1, this is the control dot.
And is that the dot that then performs that function or role that you just described when you were writing on the diagram People's Exhibit 254?
Yes.
Is there a similar dot then on the strips used to type the 5 polymarkers?
There is, and it has a designation as an S dot, but in fact it is made up of the same components and performs exactly the same function as this C dot.
All right, very good, thank you. Dr. Cotton, you also described or used the term unstained control, was it?
I either said that or I may have said substrate control.
All right. Does that item have a particular, or that term have a particular meaning to you?
Yes, it does.
What is that?
It would be best example I can think of is a stain on a garment. It would be a portion of that garment that did not have any apparent stain, which you could then type and use that to help you interpret your results on the stained portion of the garment.
In what way? How does that assist in the interpretation of any results from a stained portion?
Well, it may assist in that the control portion may not have any type at all, and that would just be a general indication that the garment itself, usually control is taken very near the stain, so I'm not thinking about taking a control on one shoulder and then looking at a stain on another shoulder. So you're taking the control near where the stain is and you're saying, well, I don't have any additional DNA besides what I'm seeing, and therefore what I'm seeing from the stain is probably all the DNA that's there. I mean, the other obvious result is that you got a type from your control section, and that might mean, for example, suppose someone had worn a shirt for a very long time, a week or something. You might actually pick up some of that person's type who had worn the shirt for a week on a control section. You might see that type reflected in a stained section as well. So it would just be information on the condition of the surrounding area of the stain.
Why would you be able to see a person's type on a garment that had been worn for some time?
Because you may have skin cells that, if you've worn a garment for a really long time, may have adhered to the fabric. And you may have a sufficient number that you would actually see a type. Now, I haven't done an experiment on this, but I've just used this as an example.
All right. As far as these unstained or substrate controls, as you've just described them, do they play any role in determining whether or not contamination of a sample may have occurred?
It doesn't, well, actually, yes, it would help you to determine that as well. If you picked up a type on the unstained portion, the other explanation, other than what is, either that type existed on that unstained portion at the time it was collected, or it had been deposited on there somewhere during the processing. And there's no way you could be able to distinguish which of those two scenarios had happened. It would just alert you to either the thing had DNA on it when you started, or some extraneous DNA may have gotten on it during the processing, and you couldn't tell the difference.
How often do you receive unstained or substrate controls in casework at Cellmark?
I don't know how to give you an exact figure. We receive them some of the time. Most of the time we do not.
As far as all of these controls that you've described, do they all represent different versions of basically lights that can be lit or alerts to you about the potential for problems?
That's exactly right.
Now, turning in particular to the strips, and these are these PCR typing strips, and I believe just a few moments ago you pointed to a DQ alpha typing strip, and then you also, or we also showed to the jury a polymarker typing strip, is that right?
That's right.
These results, and I believe you've already described this, are actually read visually. That is, a person looking at them and deciding where there are positive results and where there aren't. Is that right?
That's right.
And by positive results?
Blue dots.
Blue dots. Does one person simply read those results in the laboratory to determine what the types are that are present?
Well, not in our laboratory, and I can't speak for every laboratory. Every laboratory that does this does not have exactly the identical procedure. In our laboratory, the evidence samples are read by two individuals. If you're doing a known sample, that sample may only needs to be read by one person. But any evidence sample gets read by two people.
As far as these results themselves, are they maintained? Do the strips still exist, for instance, if you want to look at a case a day later, a week later, a year later, and so forth?
These strips still exist, and you could go look at them, but they are not the best permanent record of the results because the blue color in the dots can fade over time.
What steps, if any, do you take to record these results at the time that they're read so that they can be looked at later?
There's two things that are done. The strips are read visually by two different analysts, and those readings are recorded on paper. and the strips are photographed, and those photographs are maintained in the case file.
Are those photos then provided, for example, to prosecutors in cases?
Yes,
Are they provided to the court, for instance, on occasion?
they're provided, there are two original photos that are taken. Generally, we maintain one, and the other one is provided to the court, to the defense, or to the prosecution, whoever's in need of that copy.
Does that allow those results then to be reviewed at a later time by any of those people you've just described,
Yes,
or even by experts retained by either side?
that's right.
Now, I'd like to turn your attention, Dr. Cotton, to an area frequently referred to as proficiency testing. What is proficiency testing?
Proficiency testing is generally the receipt of samples in a laboratory where the samples are sent from an agency or an organization who's engaged in providing proficiency tests. And it's just that, it's sort of a test. The agency knows what the answers should be. They're sending samples to the laboratory. The laboratory in general is aware that these are proficiency test samples, does the analysis, reports the results back to the agency, and then the agency, which may also send these tests out to many other laboratories, will compile the results and send a report out.
What's the purpose of proficiency testing?
It's to enable you to make an unbiased judgment about how well your laboratory is performing, because you have an opportunity to do a set of samples where someone else knows what the answer should be, and also to compare how you did with how other laboratories receiving equivalent samples would do or did.
Incidentally, is Cellmark, and you described yesterday Cellmark in the United Kingdom, is it involved in providing proficiency samples to any laboratories?
Cellmark in the United Kingdom has a proficiency test program where they do provide proficiency samples to other laboratories, and we receive them, and many other labs in the United States do as well.
As far as these proficiency tests, are they taken by analysts in your laboratory?
Yes.
Who participates in taking those tests?
Everyone that is involved in doing any kind of analysis for forensic or paternity casework takes proficiency tests during the year, and generally each analyst is required to perform 2 per year.
Does that include yourself?
Includes myself and the other PhD staff, since we are involved in the analysis of the casework results.
You touched briefly yesterday on the fact that there are other individuals in your laboratory who perform the actual bench work. Is that right?
That's right.
And would this be actually pouring in the reagents, manipulating the steps necessary in the tests, and then ultimately producing the product that's eventually read and interpreted?
That's right.
In this case, and we'll return to it a little bit more a little later, in this case, who were those individuals who actually performed this work in this case?
The work in this case was done by Julie Cooper and Paula Yates.
With respect to both of those individuals, have they participated in proficiency testing as well while at Cellmark?
Yes.
These proficiency tests, can you describe in a little bit more detail about how they're set up and in what form they're sent to the laboratory for purposes of testing?
I can tell you how we receive them. I don't know very much about how they're set up, since I'm not involved in doing that. We generally will receive the samples. They're usually shipped at room temperature, and for forensics samples, they're made to be similar to case samples. So they're usually blood stains, and the knowns are usually blood stains on cotton cloth. And the evidence samples may be blood stains or semen stains or some mixture. And generally a proficiency test will consist of 3 or 4 samples, which would be the typical number of samples that might be in one case. At least that's for our laboratory. Typically for a single case, it'll be average maybe 4 samples. And they are received by our quality assurance coordinator, and then she hands them out to whoever is next in line to do a set of proficiency samples.
As far as these samples, when they're sent to you, and if, let's assume you're an analyst actually determining what the results from typing of these samples are you informed ahead of time of what the results are?
No, that's the whole point. You don't know what the results are supposed to be.
Are you therefore required to complete the test, report the results, and then later you find out if you did it correctly?
That's right.
Now, how often are these tests, and I believe you touched on that, you may have already answered this, how often are members of your laboratory required to take these tests?
Twice a year.
Are there any organizations that set recommended frequencies for taking tests like this?
There are two organizations who have guidelines for laboratories that are engaged in DNA analysis, and both of those organizations, in regards to proficiency tests, recommend that each analyst or each person involved in casework do 2 tests per year at a minimum.
What organizations are those?
One organization carries the acronym TWIGDAM, it's TWGDAM, which stands for the Technical Working Group on DNA Analysis Methods, and is sponsored by the FBI and consists of crime laboratories from around the United States and members of the FBI laboratory.
Does that group also issue guidelines on a range of areas involved in DNA testing?
They've issued guidelines on conducting DNA testing, staff for DNA testing, and quality assurance programs for laboratories engaged in DNA testing.
What was the second organization?
The second organization is ASCLD Lab, and again, it's an acronym, ASCLD/LAB. That is the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors Laboratory Accreditation Board.
If this jury had previously heard testimony about ASCLD, would that be the same organization?
It would.
When did Cellmark begin taking proficiency tests?
In 1988.
And was that shortly after the laboratory began performing casework? Or do you recall?
The first proficiency test that I'm aware of that Cellmark took was actually received in late 1987, so it would have been received about the same time, in the same time range as we started doing casework.
Do you, as part of the business at Cellmark, compile information about how the laboratory has performed in these proficiency tests since they were begun?
Yes.
As far as the taking of these tests, these proficiency tests, and the results, can you describe for us, beginning back when proficiency started, how the laboratory has performed?
Yes.
All right, would you
can.
do so?
Let me preface my remarks by a very brief explanation that proficiency tests have been available all during the time that DNA testing has been done, but early on, proficiency testing specifically designed for DNA testing labs was not available, and the tests were geared more towards serology analysis. In 1988, or actually late 1987, there was a proficiency test put together by the California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors, which Cellmark agreed to participate in. That test was not a typical proficiency test as I have just described one to you, and the reason is that that test consisted of 49 samples. There were no designated known samples and unknown samples, so what I'm really saying is that that proficiency test did not resemble a regular case in terms of the number of samples and the fact that in a normal case you have known samples and unknown samples. Apart from that, the samples were forensic type samples, stains, and so forth. In that proficiency test, we provided results back to the CACLD, which is the abbreviation for California Association of Crime Laboratory Directors. And we later found out that we had one error in that proficiency test. That is, we matched a sample to another sample, and that match was incorrect.
With regard to those results, incidentally, were the remainder of the results, how did you do on those?
The remainder of the matches that we got were okay. There are some samples that we didn't get any DNA from. There were some samples that we didn't get a pattern from that was usable. So I'm not implying the rest of the results were perfect, but there were no other incorrect matches in the results other than the one.
As far as this error, as you've described it, do you just take that error into account and just continue in your work, or do you take any action as a result of that?
I certainly wouldn't want to just continue working without attempting to figure out what had caused such a significant error. So the procedure that followed was the people that had worked on the test went back and examined all of their records, all of the tubes that they had kept during the analysis of that test, and they were able, and I'm saying they, although I was there at the time, I didn't participate directly in figuring this out. They were able to determine where the error had occurred and what had happened to cause that error, and that was helpful then in making some changes in our procedure to improve the procedure.
In what way?
Well, there were two changes made to address the error. You sort of have to know what the error was for it to make a lot of sense, but there were changes in how the tubes were labeled, so that, because part of the problem was that an analyst couldn't read the labeling well on the tube. And there was also a piece of equipment purchased to help us avoid the situation that had caused the error.
All right. In terms of proficiency tests taken after that time, can you describe the performance of the laboratory?
We're going to work up in years here, I
Okay.
assume. Okay, so then comes along 1989. Now, actually, without the document in front of me, there may have been a few other tests in 1988 besides this large one, and as far as those tests went, there was nothing wrong with Cellmark's performance. In 1989, there were tests taken, and for the most part, there was no problems with Cellmark's results. But in 1989, we again accepted a sample set from ASCLD. This sample set consisted of 50 samples, was designed the same way the first one was, and Cellmark had an additional error in 1989, an incorrect match in that 50 sample set.
As a result of that error, was any further review undertaken, or was this again or was this a situation in which you just continued on with casework?
As a result of that error, additional review was undertaken. It took quite a long time to do that review because there was a lot of material to look at. The specific error was not able to be determined. We could narrow it down to a particular two samples between which the error had occurred, and we knew the step at which the error had occurred, but exactly how it occurred, I can't tell you, and I was part of this analysis. We went in and looked at our procedure, and the adjustment that we made to our procedure as a result of this test was one that I've already talked about, and that was the mandate in the procedure that you do not do the DNA extraction for evidence and known samples at the same time in the same place. That is, you do the evidence, you put that away, and then you do the known samples. And so this was a situation where DNA from one sample had contaminated another, and obviously the most critical contamination that you could have would be from a known sample to an evidence sample. And so to avoid that, those samples are not extracted at the same time. And that was the adjustment that we made in our procedure as a result of that error in 1989.
Are changes or improvements in procedure one of the goals of proficiency testing or one of the benefits?
Well, they're one of the benefits. It does give you a window on your work that you wouldn't have if you weren't taking proficiency testing.
That was 1989, is that right?
That's right. Now, again, there would have been some other proficiency tests taken during 1989 that would be similar to the typical ones that I described before, where you get 3 or 4 samples, and there were no false matches or false exclusions in any of the other tests in 1989.
All right, what about 1990?
From 1990 to the present time, we have continued to take proficiency tests. They are all now, in fact, the proficiency tests are much better now than they were back then because they're designed for DNA analysis laboratories specifically. And as I said, they generally consist of 3 or 4 samples. And since that time, there have been no further errors in proficiency tests in terms of incorrect matches or incorrect exclusions in our proficiency testing.
During that time period from 1990 through 1995, approximately how many different tests are we talking about? Can you estimate that?
You know, that's all listed in a document that I know you have and I have a copy of, but it's not down here with me. Let's estimate it this way. We have had, for the most part during these years, 6 or 7 analysts, and they've taken at least 2 tests per year, occasionally more than that. So you're doing about, say, 14 tests per year at a minimum.
Would then one add also onto that the 3 PhDs who also perform these tests?
We don't get a separate test because the design of the test is that you do it as if it were a regular case. So we are participating in the test in our normal role for doing casework. So we don't get additional tests that are directed just towards us.
All right. As far as licenses, does Cellmark hold any licenses?
Yes, we do.
Can you describe those, please?
We hold a license to handle radioactivity. We hold a license to transport. It's a clinical laboratory under the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Act to basically that allows us to transport samples across state lines, and there's an inspection associated with that license. We have a license in the state of Maryland to do molecular biology techniques. There's an inspection associated with that license. We have a few other odd licenses that aren't very relevant.
Is there any certification or accreditation process involving DNA testing laboratories in this country?
Yes, there is.
Can you tell us about that, please?
There are actually 3 programs of which we participate in 2. One of them is sponsored by the American Association of Blood Banks, and I mentioned that, I think, yesterday. And it is an accreditation for doing paternity testing. And you can get accredited for like HLA testing or ABO testing. Since we only do DNA testing, our accreditation is in that area only.
Of paternity testing?
Yes, that is doing paternity testing using DNA analysis.
Through the American Association of Blood Banks?
That's right.
Are there any other organizations who participate in accrediting or certifying DNA laboratories?
There is another organization that accredits laboratories for paternity testing, and it's a very similar program to that of the American Association of Blood Banks, and we aren't currently participating in that program. And there is a program sponsored by ASCLD, that is the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, for accreditation of forensic laboratories doing DNA analysis. And we hold an accreditation from that organization.
I'm sorry, did you say you have been accredited by ASCLD?
Yes, we have.
As far as that accreditation, to your knowledge, were you the first private laboratory accredited by ASCLD?
Yes, there had been many, or I don't know about many, but 20-some DNA laboratories accredited by ASCLD, and these were all state labs or local labs or some type of government lab. So we were the first private for business laboratory that ASCLD accredited.
Now, in that process of accreditation by the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, What did that entail? What did it take to obtain that?
Was preparation involved about 6 months of work off and on. We submitted to them answers to a very long questionnaire. We submitted documentation of our procedures for quality assurance. We submitted documentation of our testing procedures in the laboratory. And I don't know, we submitted several, it's one of those things where you send in 3 copies and stuff like that. And then we were given an inspection date, and we had an inspection from ASCLD inspectors. We had 3 inspectors in our laboratory for 3 days, and they looked at individual cases. They looked at the laboratory facility. They interviewed all of the laboratory staff involved in forensic cases, and then they did an evaluation.
And as a result of that evaluation, what happened?
As a result of that evaluation, we received accreditation by that organization this past September.
As far as this accreditation process, did it include, for instance, the laboratory's use of RFLP typing in forensic cases?
Yes, it did.
Did it also include your laboratory's use of PCR in forensic cases?
Yes, it did.
You've also mentioned an organization that you've described as TWIGDAM or TWGDAM. Does that organization, and I believe you mentioned earlier, does that organization produce guidelines for DNA typing in forensic cases?
It does.
Can you tell us a little bit? You described some basic areas that those guidelines describe. Can you tell us in a little bit more detail how they cover forensic DNA typing?
It's very similar, although not identical, to the guidelines that you have to meet for ASCLD. The guidelines cover what kind of education and training your staff should have, what kind of quality assurance program you should have, what kind of documentation of the work that you do that you should keep. There are some specifications in there about how the DNA testing should be done, guidelines on general aspects of doing the DNA testing, and there are some guidelines as to how the results should be reported. There is then a separate document written by the same organization that covers in more detail what a good quality assurance program would encompass.
As far as these guidelines from TWIGDAM, does Cellmark follow those guidelines in its forensic casework?
Yes, we do.
Incidentally, I know you described TWIGDAM as being sponsored by the FBI, is that right?
It's made up of a lot of crime labs, and my understanding is that it's sponsored by the FBI. We're not a participant. We are not a participant in TWIGDAM, so I'm not positive that that's correct.
In terms of your human identification or forensic casework at Cellmark, are you asked to perform testing exclusively by prosecuting agencies?
No.
Who else asks you to perform casework?
We may be asked to do casework by a defense attorney. And in terms of prosecuting agencies, I guess you're including both investigators and attorneys. So we work for whoever is interested in sending us a case.
In other words, by your last answer, you were referring to being asked to perform testing by prosecutor's office, like the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office in this case.
Yes, we might receive samples from a district attorney's office, we might receive samples sent to us by a crime lab, or we might receive samples from an investigator.
As far as your testing, is it the case that in some instances you obtain test results and after that criminal charges are filed in cases?
Yes, that happens sometimes.
Is it also the case that following your testing and casework, it may be that criminal charges already filed are dismissed?
Yes, absolutely.
Is it also the case that after obtaining results in your casework that in fact people may be released from prison as a result of those casework results?
You have one moment, Your Honor, just so I can speak to counsel. Thank you.
Proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. And lastly, Dr. Cotton, has your laboratory obtained results in cases that may lead to exonerations, that is, charges actually being dismissed?
Yes.
Now, as far as the laboratory itself, do you allow individuals not a part of the laboratory to visit your laboratory?
Yes.
And what can that include?
There's two general groups of folks that might include. We might be asked to have an expert. Suppose we're doing a case for the prosecution. We might be asked that a defense expert, that is a scientist working with the defense, to be allowed to come and view the testing while it's being done. And we do allow that. We have a set of guidelines that we feel that everybody needs to agree to, and if everybody agrees to those guidelines, an expert for the defense is allowed into the lab to watch testing. And we may have the reverse situation. We may have a case that's been done for either the prosecution or the defense, and another expert working for that same group may wish to come, who may then come to court to say, yes, I think this testing is okay, or no, I don't, but usually it's, yes, I do think it's okay. That expert may come to the lab, look at the laboratory, discuss laboratory procedures, ask laboratory staff questions or something, to become familiar with how work is done in our lab.
Now, you described the fact that there are some guidelines in place about these visits.
Yes, there are.
What do they include?
As far as watching testing, the most important thing that they include is that the visitor will only be allowed in the laboratory when testing on that specific case is ongoing. And that is, there are many times during the testing where you do something and then you have to wait maybe 4 hours before you can do the next thing, so that the visitor isn't allowed in the lab during that 4-hour waiting period. They're asked to wait somewhere else. And the other really important criteria is that they're not allowed to ask questions of the analysts or talk to the analysts while the analyst is working. And that's really to make sure that the analyst is allowed to give their full attention to the samples that are in front of them, and they're not distracted by somebody saying, why are you doing that, or what step is this, or something like that.
All right, with regard to these visits, how common are they in cases?
They're not enormously common. We probably have defense experts in 3 or 4 times a year, maybe, probably not more than that.
So on the average, once every few months?
Yes,
All right, with regard to this case, did any such visits occur?
yes.
Could you describe that, please?
There were 2 visits. The first was a visit from Dr. Edward Blake and Dr. Henry Lee, and they came to the lab and witnessed and took part in, actually, the division of some of the samples. The samples were small blood-stained swatches. 10% of those samples was to be set aside for future testing, and Dr. Blake actually took the cuttings that were set aside for future testing.
All right.
And that was actually an exception to our guidelines, because normally we wouldn't let
Objection, Your Honor, just a point of clarification.
Sidebar
Yeah.
with Clarke, please. Record should reflect we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Dr. Cotton is again on the witness stand undergoing direct examination by Mr. Clarke. Mr. Clarke, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Cotton, I believe we left off, and you had described a first visit made by experts from the defense in this case,
Yes,
and you had described the fact that Dr. Blake was present.
yes,
You also described the fact that he, in fact, actually performed some cutting of some samples at that time.
that's right.
All right, I'd like to return to that in a little more detail later, but as far as these cuttings, was his role limited as far as the cuttings are concerned to actually physically cutting a portion of those pieces of evidence?
That's right.
And did the entire evidence, including both sides of the cutting, so to speak, remain in your custody?
Yes, all of the pieces remained in the custody of Cellmark.
On that occasion, and do you recall approximately when that visit was?
Well, I think it was sometime in July of last year.
Was there anyone else present with Dr. Blake?
Dr. Lee and Mr. Neufeld.
And is that Dr. Henry Lee?
Yes.
Now, were there any other visits to your laboratory by the defense in this case?
Yes.
When did that occur?
Oh, gosh.
Approximately?
I haven't a clue without going to look it up. I'm sorry.
Okay. Is that something that you could look up during the break before tomorrow?
I
Or-
can look it up before
All right.
tomorrow.
I take it that means we're not going to finish today.
I am not confident in finishing today, Your Honor. I'm sorry.
Let's move along.
Without getting into the date, Dr. Cotton, do you recall who was present during that visit? Who actually
Yes.
made the visit?
Yes, Dr. John Gertis came to visit the laboratory.
And this was an individual also working for the defense at that time?
That's correct.
What was the nature of that visit?
He came to the laboratory to basically look at the laboratory layout. We did that during the visit, and the mission was to examine documents that we hold at Cellmark that he or the defense wished that he look at.
Had he ever visited your laboratory before?
No, he had not.
All right. With respect to the types of cases your laboratory takes, you've described the fact that they involve human identification or forensic casework,
That's right.
paternity testing as well.
That's right.
I think
As
that's
far-
about the 6th time we've asked that question.
As far as other cases, does your laboratory have any contracts or have you had any contracts with the federal government?
We had a contract with the Department of Defense. I don't know that the contract is not still working. Or I don't know what the right term for that is, but it's done. And the contract was for doing analysis for Desert Storm casualties.
So that was to help identify remains from the Persian Gulf War.
Yes.
Now, approximately how many cases does your laboratory perform work on in the course of a year?
Usually between 400 and 500.
And is that split up in any manner, paternity cases versus forensic
Oh,
cases?
I'm sorry. That 400 to 500 would be forensic cases only, and the paternity cases would be, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500.
You brought up the term earlier today, quality assurance. What is that?
Basically, it's the set of procedures that are worked alongside your normal work to make sure that the equipment is functioning and to ensure that the quality of the work that comes out of the laboratory is always high.
Do you actually have a person who's assigned this area of quality assurance?
Yes, we do.
And what's that person's role? What does he or she do?
She does a whole lot of different things. It might be a little easier just to sort of say what happens in a quality assurance program.
All right.
But, for example, it includes being able to track and when reagents are made. That is, things come into the lab and they're used to make solutions, so they're records of those solutions. There are many different things in the labs that have to be at constant temperature, so all the refrigerators, freezers, water baths, and so on, all those temperatures are maintained. She's also responsible for administering and looking at proficiency tests. She does audits of the laboratory, that is, every month or 2 months, she will walk through the laboratory unannounced and check out to make sure that all the equipment is in order. Anything that should have been calibrated or adjusted on a routine basis, the records are in place that those calibrations or adjustments have been done. And I guess that's the general idea of what she does. And now I don't remember where I was supposed to go from there.
Just in terms of quality assurance, this person performs this function of overseeing quality assurance as
She
you've described it?
yes, she oversees it. That doesn't mean she goes and does all the temperature checks, but she oversees the entire program.
Dr. Cotton, if you would you allow Mr. Clarke to finish asking the question before you start your answer?
Yes,
Because
sir.
we were both talking together.
Now, as far as casework, you receive cases in the laboratory, is that right?
That's correct.
What steps do you take to ensure that when you receive, for instance, a set of evidence samples and let's say 1 or 2 known samples, to ensure that the chain of custody or the integrity of that evidence remains proper?
The samples are assigned to a specific analyst. The analyst logs in each of the samples on a form. That means he or she writes down a specific description of the items that are received, how they were received, from whom they were received. We usually get a letter with the samples that says who we are allowed to contact regarding results, who we're going to send a bill to, and so on. The analyst has specific areas within a locked evidence room where he or she stores the materials. The analyst has custody of the materials the entire time they're at Cellmark, and during the testing keeps detailed records of where the samples are, at what stage in the testing. That is, she doesn't write down where they are because they would be in her area of the refrigerator or freezer, but she or he would write down they're in the freezer, they're in the refrigerator, if that was important to keep track. And there are a lot of forms that get filled out during the testing that document how the testing was performed. And then at the end of the testing, after the report is written, that person then returns the evidence or anything remaining from the evidence to the submitter.
You've described earlier that 2 individuals who actually performed testing in this case were Julie Cooper and, I'm sorry, did you mention the second individual?
I did, Paula Yates.
Paula Yates. Is there a title that they have in the laboratory?
Both Julie and Paula are senior molecular biologists.
Why were there 2 individuals performing the actual testing in this case?
Julie originally received the samples in this case, and sometime after she started the samples, she accepted a job at the Maryland State DNA Laboratory, where she's now a supervisor. And so because she was leaving Cellmark, she transferred custody of all of the materials at that time to Paula Yates, who continued on with the testing until it was completed.
Are you familiar with the qualifications of both Julie Cooper and Paula Yates?
Yes.
Can you briefly describe each of their qualifications at the time of their testing?
Both of them had worked for Cellmark for about 6 years. Paula is the supervisor of the forensic group, has a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Maryland, and about 6 years' experience in doing forensic testing. Julie has a master's degree in forensic science from George Washington University. She also had about 6 years of experience in forensic testing.
Had you, prior to this case, previously worked with both of those individuals, Julie Cooper and Paula Yates?
Yes, many times.
And is that something, well, let me rephrase that. Did you in fact work with them on a number of cases prior to this case?
Yes.
Have you had an opportunity to review their casework in previous cases as well?
Yes.
As far as the testing techniques that are used in the laboratory, do you have in place protocols about how tests are to be conducted?
Yes, we do.
First of all, what is a protocol?
Basically, it's sort of like a recipe book. It lists all the steps on how to do the test. in a lot of detail.
Do these protocols apply to both your RFLP typing as well as your PCR typing?
Yes, there's a separate there's one book basically for RFLP and another book for PCR testing.
Is it common in science to have protocols describing how to conduct scientific tests?
Very common.
As far as these protocols, is it something, for instance, for either RFLP typing or PCR-based typing that's relatively short, or is it detailed and extensive?
I've seen protocols that are relatively short, and I've seen them that are detailed and extensive, and ours happens to be detailed and extensive.
Do you have any role in, for instance, either the creation or changes that are made to these written protocols?
Yes.
Can you describe that, please?
As laboratory director, my signature is required for final approval for any change in the procedure, and my signature is required yearly on the procedure as evidence of a yearly review. So I participate in that yearly review with the quality assurance coordinator, and if we decide to make a change or an addition to the protocol, someone else certainly might write that, and many people may look at it, but it requires my signature as laboratory director to be put into place
I gather then changes are made to the protocol.
frequently.
Why is that?
Many of the changes are simply additions. That is, we might add, for example, we were doing DQ alpha, and then we wanted to do the polymarker testing, so we had to write protocols that now included the polymarker testing. But the other thing is that you might go to a scientific meeting or read something in the literature where someone had discussed a procedure that gave very good results. You would then check that out in your laboratory, and then if it was giving better results than your current procedure, you would go ahead and change your protocol to reflect the improvement.
Is that the nature of science itself?
Yes.
As far as these protocols, do they start at a particular portion of the testing process and end at another one? Does that question make any sense?
Well, it just covers all the steps.
Okay, from what point to what point?
It starts at how do you log in the evidence? How do you properly receive the evidence is where it starts.
And then where does it end?
It ends in how do you interpret the results.
Are individuals who are working in the laboratory, such as Julie Cooper and Paula Yates, required to follow these protocols?
Yes.
What happens when something comes up in the course of testing?
Kind
That
of
the-
vague, isn't it?
Yes, it was. Perhaps if I add a little more to it. What happens if something comes up in the course of testing that isn't covered by the protocols? What happens?
Generally, first you would make some notations about that in the case notes, and then you might consult with someone else. If there's something, if we think that something should be done that's unusual, that's outside the protocol, then we'll make notations about that, and that generally would require approval of one of the PhD staff.
Were your protocols reviewed by the ASCLD inspection team prior to you receiving their accreditation?
Yes, they were.
Now, you've described the fact that records are kept in the course of receiving evidence through the various testing processes. Is that right?
That's right.
And are you familiar with how those records are kept by the analysts themselves?
Yes, I am.
What's the basis? How come you're familiar with how they're done?
When my role in the case is to get all the records and including the results and a draft report and review the records, review the data, and review the report and participate in signing that report with the person who actually did the work with their own hands. So as part of my everyday job, I'm going through case records, reading them, checking them, making sure that they're all in order so that I can sign the case when it's done.
To be able to describe results in a given case, how can you do that without actually sitting there and watching every step of the testing process?
When you're done with the test, you have some data, you have some information. So what I'm doing is participating with the analyst in interpretation of that data. And I have not sat and watched. I mean, if I was going to sit and watch, I might as well do it myself. I have not sat and watched every step of the test.
As far as your ability to offer an opinion, do you review all of the material in a given case prior to offering any opinions about it,
Yes.
whether that's in the form of testimony or in a written report?
In either case, I would be reviewing all of the data and most of the documentation in the folder.
Okay, I'd like to turn your attention to an area that's commonly referred to as population frequencies. Is that term familiar to you?
Yes, it is.
All right, what is that?
It's the expression of saying for a particular genetic characteristic within a population or large group of people, how often would you expect to find that characteristic?
For instance, would population frequencies enter into a description of approximately how many people have the ABO type, blood group type O, for instance?
Yes.
As far as population frequencies, could you describe, please, the education and training you've received in the area of frequencies?
My exposure to this particular area of biology has mainly been in the 7 years that I've been at Cellmark, because we deal with defining frequencies for the genetic markers that we use every day. So I have no specific training outside of Cellmark. We have a person on our staff who has a PhD in this particular area, and as a part of my job, and when I go to scientific meetings, I'm both hearing lectures in this area, and I make it a point to read the literature in this area as well.
How about your experience with frequencies in, for instance, casework?
Well, in terms of doing a case, if you have samples that are consistent with some known person, and this is part of your report, then as part of your report, if there is sufficient data, you're saying how often you might see this particular set of genetic characteristics. So in all the not all, but many of the reports that go out involve the calculation of frequencies for particular sets of genetic characteristics.
Do you consult with experts in the area of, well, let me rephrase that question. Is there a particular area of science that deals with, in particular, the area of populations and frequencies of genetic marker characteristics?
Yes, there is.
What's that called?
That discipline would be referred to as population genetics.
Do you, and have you, as a result of your employment at Cellmark since, I'm sorry, what year?
1988.
Have you consulted with population genetics experts about this area of population frequencies?
Yes, we have.
And I believe you mentioned that you had an individual in your laboratory whose field of specialty is population genetics?
Yes, one of our PhD staff, Dr. Lisa Foreman, is a population geneticist.
Do you routinely consult with her about population frequency information?
Certainly.
As far as work conducted in your laboratory, do you then use population frequency data as a means of describing the significance of your results?
Yes.
To your knowledge, has population frequency data been used for a substantial period of time?
Oh, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's certainly been used in DNA typing since laboratories were initially engaged in that, but in terms of formulating information about serological results, the same kinds of calculations and information is usually provided. So if you have a set of information that includes blood types and PGM or however many markers you've done, you can do a calculation to say this particular set of markers would occur in some percentage of a particular population.
Is that related to, is it similar, different from population frequency use in DNA typing?
I would object, and I would ask that I could need a very brief idea on her expertise in this particular area.
Or we're still establishing that at this point.
Okay.
Do you recall the question?
Could you go ask it again?
Actually, Your Honor, would it be possible to have that reread, because I can't recall it
Is
exactly?
that related?
Actually, I can, I'm sorry. As far as this use of population frequency data, has it been in use for a substantial period of time?
Yes.
Objection, Your Honor, foundation.
As far as its use, that is the use of population frequencies in casework, when did you begin using population frequency data in terms of reporting it in actual cases?
Are you talking about me personally or Cellmark in general?
Let's start with the laboratory.
Okay. There's going to be a little bit of time, there's a time frame in here where I can't be particularly accurate about the answer. I came to Cellmark in 1988, and sometime during that year, I started being involved in forensic casework. At the time that I started being involved in forensic casework, we were in the process of developing population data that would allow us to do that. I think that we were all providing some frequencies before that based on population data from the other Cellmark laboratory, but I'm not absolutely certain.
What about you personally?
The point at which I would have become involved would have been the point at which I began signing forensic casework, and I was also involved in setting up how the population samples at Cellmark would be analyzed and reported. So at that point, I became involved in discussing, understanding, and generating population frequencies as they relate to DNA typing.
Do you have any role in supervising the actual reporting of frequencies in your laboratory, that is in casework?
In terms of signing a particular case, both people who are signing that case have a role in generating and reporting that information. So in my role in signing cases, I am responsible for the information that's generated for that particular case. And I also have overall responsibility for the scientific information that comes out of the laboratory. So under that umbrella, I guess I would have some responsibility as well.
As far as your previous testimony as an expert in DNA typing, have you reported population frequencies during that testimony?
Yes, I have.
And I'm sorry, how many times did you said approximately you testified previously?
Oh, probably about 90 times.
And amongst that 90, is there any way you can put a figure or a rough estimate of the percentage of the time you report population frequency data?
I couldn't give you an exact figure since I'm not even giving you an exact figure of how many times I've testified, but for most of the cases, probably 80 or 90% of the cases in which testimony is provided in court, we are providing some population genetic frequency for a particular set of markers.
The written protocols you have in place in the laboratory, do they describe the reporting of population frequencies?
Yes, they do.
And in what manner? Is it fairly short, detailed? Can you describe that?
The calculations, although they're done by computer, can also be done by hand, and the protocol simply describes how to go about entering that data. And that's for RFLP. For PCR results, we do not have a computer program to do the calculations for us, so the calculations are done by hand. And when you review a case, in my role in reviewing a case, those calculations have been done by the analyst. I'm checking them, and then we're both signing the report.
When you say that those are done by hand, do you mean by using a calculator or really by hand?
No, I mean by writing the individual frequencies down so that we have a permanent record of them, and then by using a calculator to multiply them together.
All right. With regard to this concept of population frequencies, how do you calculate them for a given type, for instance, at a given genetic marker?
Objection at this point to foundation, Your Honor.
Sustain.
With regard to this area of population frequencies, is there a term called database?
Yes.
What's a database?
It's basically a sample of a population. Obviously you can't sample all the people in the country, or you couldn't even sample all the people in a given state. So you need to take a small subset of the total population and then regard that as your sample. It's similar to taking a poll for television viewing. Nobody calls up everybody who's watched television on a particular night. They take a sample of the people who have watched television on a particular night and make some assessment of the larger sample based on the larger population based on the small sample.
And how does that play a role in your ability to be able to estimate how common or how rare a set of characteristics is?
Well, I think you've just actually said the important word, that is estimate. If I have a sample of 200 individuals, for example, and I do an RFLP test on all those 200 individuals, I've now looked at, for any given genetic locus, I've looked at 400 chromosomes. So I have 400 pieces of information. And from that, I can ask the question, if I have a DNA band that's 5,000 base pairs long for this particular genetic locus, how often in my population sample do I find a person with this genetic characteristic, a DNA band at 5,000 base pairs?
Does that involve then the use of more than one database for a particular genetic marker?
Traditionally, databases are divided into racial or ethnic groups.
Objection again is foundation rather than traditional.
Overruled.
You may continue.
Our databases at Cellmark are divided into racial or ethnic groups. You could maintain any number of databases. In our laboratory, we have 3. They are popular, and I guess for the moment I'll just speak about RFLP, but the situation for PCR is similar, and they are divided into African Americans, Caucasians, and Hispanics.
Why this concern with different databases from different racial or ethnic groups?
Objection of foundation is their expertise to comment.
Sustain.
With regard to the area of population frequencies, are you familiar with other DNA laboratories and their methods of calculating these estimations of how common or how rare characteristics are?
Yes, I am.
How are you familiar with that?
Both from reading the literature, talking to other scientists, and hearing information presented at scientific meetings.
Is this something you do on a regular basis?
Do those things?
Yes.
Yes.
What about scientific literature? Does it play any role in your knowledge of the area of population frequency data?
Yes.
Can you describe that in more detail?
Well, there's actually, at this point, this was not the situation in 1988, for example, but at this point, there is a lot of information in the literature about population data based on DNA typing. So anyone who is interested or involved in doing DNA typing analysis, either for paternity or for forensics, would be interested and need to keep up with this literature.
What types of literature do you read in that area, other than the general topic, obviously? But are there particular resources that you have in terms of particular journals and so forth?
There are 2 journals in which would include most of the papers, certainly not all. One would be the Journal of Forensic Science, and the other would be the American Journal of Human Genetics. Now, there are a few papers that are somewhere else. There's a couple in Science. Anyway, they're here and there, but for the most part, the 2 journals have covered more of them than maybe some other journals.
If you could, describe how do those journals, how closely do they deal with this actual concept of population frequencies and reporting results following DNA typing?
Objection, hearsay, and no foundation as to her expertise on this area.
Overruled. Proceed.
And may invite you to witness.
Overruled. Proceed.
Are you sort of asking me what types of things are in the literature?
That you read, yes, in this area of population frequencies.
What I'm allowing counsel is, what is the source of her knowledge in this area?
Yes.
All right, rephrase the question.
All right. With respect to your review of scientific literature regarding population frequencies, can you just tell us, as far as the literature you've described, does it